I never said I was her father. Not once in 22 years did I sit her down and demand that title. I didn't ask her to call me Dad. I didn't correct people at parent-teacher nights when she introduced me as Mitchell. I just showed up. Every morning. Every flu. Every recital where she played the third clarinet and missed half her notes. I'm 63 years old. My name is Mitchell Halverson. I was born in Brandon, Manitoba, raised in a duplex with thin walls and a father who worked the rail yards until his lungs gave out. I moved to Calgary in 1986 chasing the oil boom, married late, lost that one to ovarian cancer in 1999, and figured the second half of my life would be quiet. Then I met Genevieve at a curling club bonspiel in Okotoks the winter of 2002. She was 34, divorced, working as a dental hygienist, raising a 6-year-old daughter named Brielle on her own. The biological father had moved to Australia with a yoga instructor and stopped sending money the same month he stopped sending birthday cards. Brielle didn't ask about him. She had learned not to. I married Genevieve in the summer of 2004 at a small ceremony at Heritage Park. Brielle was 8. She wore a yellow dress and held my hand walking down the aisle. Because her mother thought it would be sweet, she told me that night, with a kid's seriousness, that she was glad I was sticking around. I told her I was glad too. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened at the rehearsal dinner. I want you to understand that I never tried to replace anyone. I never spoke ill of her biological father, even when he resurfaced for one Christmas card in 2011 and disappeared again. I never asked for thanks. I paid for braces in grade 7. I drove her to figure skating at 5 in the morning at the Father David Bauer Arena. I sat through 3 university convocations, undergrad at the University of Calgary, then her master's at McGill, then her law school at Osgoode Hall in Toronto. I paid for all of it. Not loans, not lines of credit, cash, out of the engineering consultancy I built from a basement office to a 14-person firm in Quarry Park. Genevieve and I had a good marriage, I thought. Or at least a comfortable one. We had our routines. She took the dog to the off-leash park in Edworthy. I made the coffee. We took a trip every February. Mexico, sometimes Arizona. We fought about ordinary things. Money, in-laws, the thermostat, never about Brielle. That was the thing. We never fought about Brielle, because there was nothing to fight about. I loved that kid like she was my own, and I really did think that she felt the same way. She got engaged in July of last year to a young man named Tobias Renfrew. He's a corporate associate at one of the big firms on Bay Street. Decent kid. Quiet, polite, handshake a little limp, but I didn't hold that against him. His family is from Oakville. Old money. The kind that doesn't talk about money because they've never had to think about it. His mother runs a charitable foundation. His father is on the board of 2 banks I won't name. The wedding was set for this past September at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. 240 guests. A string quartet for the ceremony. A 9-piece band for the reception, a custom chuppah-style arch made of locally sourced hemlock, even though neither family is Jewish, because Brielle had seen one on Pinterest and decided it was beautiful. I wrote the checks, all of them. The venue deposit, $68,000, the catering, $112,000, the dress from a designer in Yorkville, $14,000, the flowers, the photographer, the honeymoon. 3 weeks in Tuscany and the Amalfi Coast. By the time the rehearsal dinner rolled around in late August, I had spent just over $400,000 on that wedding. I didn't begrudge any of it. She was my daughter. That's what fathers do. Or that's what I thought. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant on King Street West in Toronto. We flew in 2 days early. Genevieve and I were staying at the Park Hyatt. Brielle had booked it for us as a kind of thank you, which I appreciated at the time. Tobias's parents hosted the dinner. About 40 people, the immediate family, the wedding party, a handful of close friends. I was sitting between Genevieve and Tobias's grandmother, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 80s who kept asking me if I'd ever read Robertson Davies. I said I'd read Fifth Business in my 20s, and she nodded like I'd passed the test. Brielle's biological uncle was there. Genevieve's brother, Reginald. Reggie, we called him. He'd flown in from Halifax. He's a retired high school principal. Bit of a windbag, the kind of man who corrects your grammar at Thanksgiving. He'd never been particularly warm to me over the years. I chalked it up to family stuff that predated me. Family loyalty. The suspicion of the outsider who came in and fixed the roof. Halfway through the entree, Reggie tapped his glass and stood up. He gave a short speech. Talked about Brielle as a little girl. Mentioned her late grandfather, his and Genevieve's father. Then he said, and I'm going to remember this phrasing until the day they put me in the ground. He said, and of course, we want to keep tomorrow about real family. The people who were always there from the beginning. The room went a little quiet, the kind of quiet where people pretend they didn't hear something they definitely heard. Genevieve looked at her plate. Tobias's mother looked confused. I felt my face go warm and my hands go cold, the way they used to when I was a foreman at a job site, and somebody was about to get killed if I didn't intervene. I looked at Brielle. I waited for her to laugh it off, to roll her eyes at her uncle, to say, Reggie, knock it off. She didn't. She just kept eating. The dinner ended. People filtered out into the street to find taxis. Genevieve went to the washroom. I asked Brielle if I could speak with her for a minute. We stepped onto the patio. I said, Sweetheart, what your uncle said in there. I want to clear the air. I assume he was speaking for himself. She looked at me. 28 years old, hair pulled back, the same upturned nose she'd had at 6. She took a breath like she'd been waiting for this moment for a long time. She said, Mitchell, I need to be honest with you about something. She has never called me Mitchell. Not since she was 8 years old. She called me Mitch when she was being sweet. She called me M when she was being cheeky. She called me her stepdad to her friends, her dad to teachers when she was little, and just nothing, no name at all like a person you live with, for most of the last 15 years. But that night she called me Mitchell. She said, The greatest gift you could give me tomorrow is not coming. I love that you've been around. I appreciate everything you've done. But you're not my real dad. You're just Mitchell. And tomorrow is about my real family. Tobias's family is going to be there, and they're traditional, and I don't want to have to explain who you are. Reggie offered to walk me down the aisle. He's my mom's brother. He's blood. And that's what feels right. I didn't say anything for a moment. The traffic on King Street kept moving. A streetcar bell rang somewhere. I said, Did your mother know you're saying this to me? She said, We talked about it last week. That hit me harder than the rest. They had talked about it last week, while I was on the phone with the florist sorting out the dahlia order. While I was wiring the final balance to the caterer, I said, And you didn't think to mention this to me before I paid for everything? She said, And I want you to hear this because I've heard it in my head every night for 6 months. She said, Well, I assumed you'd want to do this for me anyway. As a gesture, to show you really did love me, even without being there. There was no anger in her face, no malice, just the casual confidence of someone who has been told her whole life that she is the center of the world and has finally had it confirmed in writing. Genevieve came out onto the patio. She saw our faces. She said, Mitch, can we talk about this back at the hotel? I said, I think you should have talked to me about it last week, with your daughter, before I wrote the last check. She didn't apologize. She didn't deny it. She said, It's complicated. Brielle has been working through some feelings about her identity, about her father. We didn't want to upset you. You didn't want to upset me, I said, while I was paying. Mitch, she said, don't make a scene. I'm 63 years old. I've worked construction sites where men lost fingers and didn't cry. I've buried a wife. I buried both my parents. I have not made a scene since I was 19 years old and drunk at a wedding social in Winnipeg. I had no intention of making one then. I said, "All right." Just that. And I walked back into the restaurant, paid the portion of the bill that hadn't been covered by Tobias's parents, and got into a taxi alone. I went back to the Park Hyatt. I packed my suitcase. I called Air Canada and changed my flight to a 6 a.m. departure to Calgary. I left a note on the desk for Genevieve. It said, "I'm going home. You and your family enjoy the wedding. Please don't call me until I call you. Mitchell." I underlined the Mitchell. I flew home. I didn't sleep on the plane. I watched the sun come up over the prairies through that little oval window, and I thought about every birthday party, every science fair, every flight I'd taken to see her at McGill in February when she was homesick. I thought about the time she got food poisoning her first year at Osgood, and I drove 18 hours straight through to bring her home for reading week. I thought about the down payment I'd put on her condo in Liberty Village 2 years ago. Not a loan, a gift. $85,000. By the time the plane landed in Calgary, I knew what I was going to do. I wasn't angry. That's the part nobody ever believes. I wasn't even hurt anymore. I was clear. The way you get clear when you finally see a load-bearing wall for what it is, and realize the whole structure was wrong from the start. I drove home from the airport. I made myself a coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where I'd helped Brielle with grade 9 algebra and grade 12 chemistry, and I made a list. The first call I made was to my lawyer, a woman named Priscilla Tarrenton Beaumont. I've used her firm for 20 years. She handles my will, my corporate matters, my real estate. I told her what had happened. I told her I wanted to file for divorce. I told her I wanted it done quickly, cleanly, and without drama. But I also wanted it done correctly. Alberta is not a community property province in the strict sense. It's matrimonial property, which sounds the same, but isn't. I'd had a prenuptial agreement drawn up before I married Genevieve in 2004. She'd signed it without complaint at the time. She thought I was being silly. The agreement protected my consulting firm and the house I'd owned before the marriage, which we had lived in together for the entire marriage. It also protected an investment portfolio I'd built up before we met. What it didn't protect was the cottage in Canmore. We'd bought that together in 2009, joint title. That would have to be sorted. The second call I made was to my accountant. I asked him to flag every check I'd written for the wedding and to compile the total. I asked him to prepare a memo on which expenses had been refundable and which had not. I asked him to begin the process of unwinding everything that could still be unwound. The honeymoon was on my Aeroplan and a credit card in my name. I canceled both. The travel insurance covered most of the air. The hotels were mostly non-refundable, but I canceled them anyway and ate the loss. The wedding band, the 9-piece band, they had a clause in their contract for cancellation more than 30 days out. We were 3 weeks out. They kept the deposit. Fine. The caterer was already past the cancellation window. I called them anyway. I spoke to the owner directly. I explained, calmly, that there had been a family emergency and that the wedding was being postponed indefinitely. I asked about the deposit. They'd taken 60%. I'd paid the remaining 40% earlier that week. He said he'd refund me 30% of the remaining balance as a goodwill gesture, given that he could rebook the date. I thanked him. The vineyard was harder. The contract was airtight. They kept everything. $140,000 gone. I treated it as the price of an education. The dress was ready for pickup. The shop in Yorkville called me on Monday morning. I told them not to release it. The bride would have to come pick it up herself as she wanted it. They said the balance was already paid. I said, yes, I know, I paid it. I'm telling you, I'm not picking it up. She can. The condo in Liberty Village. This is where it gets interesting. When I'd given Brielle the down payment 2 years earlier, I'd done so through a structure my lawyer had recommended. The $85,000 was a registered loan against the property, secured by a second mortgage in my name. At the time, I'd told Brielle and Genevieve that this was for tax reasons. They nodded, uninterested. Brielle had signed the documents at my lawyer's office without reading them. She was 26 and impatient, and the condo had a rooftop terrace, and she wanted to get to a yoga class. The loan was callable on 30 days' notice. I called it. Then there was the matter of the consulting firm. Genevieve had been on the payroll for 12 years as a part-time bookkeeper. It was a tax-efficient arrangement. She came in 2 afternoons a week, ran reports, made coffee, chatted with the receptionist. The salary was modest, but the benefits package was substantial. Full medical, dental, a generous RRSP match. I called my office manager on Monday morning and told her to begin the process of formally terminating Genevieve's employment with proper notice and severance per Alberta employment standards. No drama, no cause, just a clean restructuring. The cottage in Canmore. We had bought it together, but I had paid the down payment, and the mortgage had been paid down primarily from my accounts. My lawyer told me the most efficient path was to offer Genevieve a buyout of her share, calculated on a fair market basis with offsets from my disproportionate contributions. If she rejected the offer, we'd litigate. She would lose, and she would pay her own legal fees, and I had the receipts going back 15 years. The house. The big one. Our principal residence in Aspen Woods. That one I had owned outright before the marriage. The prenup protected it, but I didn't want to live there anymore. There were too many photographs in too many rooms. I called a realtor I'd worked with on a commercial property and asked her to quietly prepare a listing. Now, here is where I want to slow down. Because what happened next is what people never expect. I did all of this in 5 days. By the end of that week, every cancelable expense was canceled. Every recoverable deposit was being recovered. The divorce filing was drafted. The loan was called. The cottage offer was prepared. The house listing was being staged for photos, and I had not sent a single text message or made a single phone call to either Genevieve or Brielle. The wedding went ahead. I know because Genevieve called me on the Saturday night, sobbing from a bathroom at the Vineyard. She said the caterer had been a disaster. A different caterer, a panicked replacement. She said the band had canceled, and they'd hired a DJ off Kijiji. She said the photographer had refused to release the engagement photos until a balance was settled. She said the hotel rooms for the honeymoon had been canceled, and Tobias and Brielle had spent their wedding night at his parents' house in Oakville. She said, "Mitch, what did you do?" I said, "I didn't do anything. I stopped doing things." She said, "You ruined her wedding." I said, "I gave her exactly what she asked for." She asked me not to come. I didn't come. She told me I wasn't her real dad. So I stopped acting like one. That's all. She said, "We can fix this. Come back. We'll talk." I said, "Genevieve, I want you to understand something. I am not angry. I am not yelling. I am sitting on my back deck, looking at the mountains, and I am perfectly calm. I am also done. There is nothing to talk about. You knew. You knew last week. You let me write the checks. You let me fly to Toronto. You let me sit at that dinner. You watched your brother humiliate me, and you said nothing. So now I'm saying nothing. Good night." I hung up. I poured myself a Glenmorangie. I went to bed. The next morning, Brielle called me. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message. It was 9 minutes long. I listened to the first 30 seconds. She was crying. She said I had embarrassed her in front of Tobias's family. She said his mother had asked pointed questions about who paid for what. She said Tobias was upset. She said the loan call was vindictive, and she didn't have $85,000. She said I was being childish. I deleted the voicemail. I didn't call her back. She called 12 more times that week. Genevieve called 19. I let every one go to voicemail. My lawyer was the only person I authorized to communicate on my behalf. She did so professionally and without emotion, which is what I pay her for. 3 weeks later, I got a letter from a lawyer in Toronto. Brielle had retained counsel. They were challenging the loan, claiming I had misrepresented it as a gift. Priscilla wrote back politely with copies of the signed documents, the disbursement records, and a notarized affidavit from Brielle's signature witness, a paralegal in Priscilla's own office who remembered the meeting clearly because Brielle had complained about the parking validation. Brielle's lawyer dropped the matter within 2 weeks. The condo went on the market. She didn't have the $85,000. She didn't have the cushion. Her associate's salary at the firm she'd just started at was not enough to refinance and pay me out. And Tobias, it turned out, did not have access to family money the way Brielle had assumed he did. Old money in Oakville, as it happens, is often locked up in trusts that don't open until the patriarch dies. Tobias was on a base salary like everyone else. She sold the condo. She paid me back. She took the remainder, which wasn't much after the Toronto market correction that year, and they moved into a one-bedroom rental in Leslieville. Genevieve and I were divorced 11 months after the rehearsal dinner. She got the cottage in Canmore. I bought out her share at a fair price, the same price I would have offered any business partner. No more, no less. She got half of the matrimonial property accumulated during the marriage, which was less than she expected because most of my wealth had been built before we met, and she had signed away her claim to it on our wedding day, smiling, in 2004. She moved to Kelowna to be closer to her sister. We don't speak. Reggie, the uncle, the principal, the man who stood up at that rehearsal dinner, he wrote me a letter in November. A long letter, 2 pages, single-spaced. He apologized. He said he hadn't realized the damage he'd done. He said he'd been speaking emotionally, that he'd always felt protective of his sister and his niece, that he hadn't meant for things to spiral. I didn't write back. Not because I'm holding a grudge. Just because I genuinely don't have anything to say to him. He was honest that night about how he saw me. I appreciated the honesty. The honesty was the most useful thing anyone had said to me in 22 years. I sold the house in Aspen Woods last spring. I bought a smaller place near Bragg Creek on 3 acres, with a workshop in the back where I've started restoring old wooden canoes. There's a chestnut prospector in there right now from 1957 that needs new ribs and a full recanvas. It's slow work. It's good work. It uses my hands. I joined a curling league. I see my brother and Brandon twice a year. I have dinner once a week with 2 old colleagues from the firm. I sold the firm last fall to my senior associate, a woman named Yolanda Chang Halberstam, who's run the place better than I did for years. The sale closed at a number I won't repeat, but it means I won't have to think about money for the rest of my life. I am 63. I am not bitter. I want you to hear that, because I know how this story sounds. I want to be very clear that I do not lie awake at night, plotting against anyone. I do not check Brielle's social media. I do not know if she still works at that firm. I do not know if she and Tobias are still together. I do not want to know. What I know is this. For 22 years I built a life with people who, when it came time to choose, chose blood. And I respect that. Blood is a real thing. I'm not going to argue with biology. But I am going to tell you what nobody tells you about being a stepfather, which is that you are running a marathon nobody is timing, and at the end of it, somebody else gets the medal, and you are expected to applaud. I declined to applaud. That's the whole story. That's all I did. I declined to keep clapping for a performance I had paid for and been told I couldn't watch. I went home. I closed my wallet. I let the people who claimed her as real family take responsibility for being her real family. And it turned out, when the bills came due, that being real family is a lot more expensive than they had realized. There's a man at the curling club, a retired farmer named Whitaker, who told me something a few months ago that I think about a lot. We were sitting in the lounge after a match. He'd lost his wife the year before, and his kids were squabbling over the estate. He said, "Mitch, the hardest thing about being a man my age is figuring out who's owed your kindness and who's just been receiving it." I think about that sentence a lot. I gave my kindness to Brielle for 22 years. I don't regret a single dollar or a single 4 a.m. drive. I'd do it all again, knowing how it ended. Because the doing was the right thing. The doing was who I was. But the receiving stopped being earned a long time before that rehearsal dinner. I just hadn't been paying attention. The dinner was the moment I started paying attention. Some nights I sit out on the deck behind the new place. The mountains are out there in the dark. I can hear coyotes some nights. I can hear the creak when the wind is right. I drink one whiskey, never more. And I think about my first wife, Adele, who died too young. And I think about what she would say if she could see me now. I think she'd say I did the right thing. Not because of revenge, because of self-respect, because there comes a point in every man's life when he has to decide whether he is going to be the person who keeps writing checks in exchange for being tolerated, or whether he is going to be the person who closes the checkbook and finds out who he is on the other side of it. I'm finding out. It turns out I'm a man who restores canoes and curls on Tuesday nights and reads Robertson Davies in the evening because an old woman at a dinner party suggested it once. It turns out I'm a man who can be alone without being lonely. Brielle never apologized. Not once. I don't expect she ever will. I'm at peace with that. An apology now wouldn't change what was true at that table on King Street. The truth was already in the room. She just had the courage to say it out loud, and her uncle had the courage to back her up, and her mother had the cowardice to stay silent. None of those three things are things I can fix. They aren't mine to fix. What was mine to fix was my own life, and I fixed it. I never said I was her dad, but for 22 years, I acted like one. I'm done acting now. I'm sitting on the deck behind the place near Bragg Creek as I think this through, and I want to say something to anyone watching who has been in a version of my chair, not the same chair. Every chair is different, but a chair where you've been giving for years and you're starting to wonder if anyone has noticed. The thing nobody told me about being a stepfather, and the thing I had to learn the hard way, is that kindness without limits is not kindness. It's a transaction the other person hasn't agreed to. When I wrote those checks for 22 years, without ever once asking Brielle to acknowledge what they cost me, I wasn't being generous. I was teaching her that I would always be there no matter what she did, and once a person learns that lesson, they stop seeing you. You become weather, furniture, background. Cause and effect is the most honest law I know. Genevieve stayed silent at that dinner because she had been allowed to stay silent for years on smaller things, and silence had always worked for her. Brielle said what she said because nobody, not me, not her mother, not a single teacher or boyfriend, had ever drawn a line and held it. Reginald gave that speech because he had decided I was an outsider in 2004, and nobody, including me, had ever asked him to update that opinion. Every one of those moments at the rehearsal dinner was the harvest of seeds I had planted myself by never saying no. So if there's a lesson in any of this, it's this. Be a good man. Be honest. Work hard. Pay your share and then some. But understand that decency does not exempt you from the responsibility of telling people what you require in return. Self-respect is not the opposite of love. It's the foundation that makes love possible. The day you stop respecting yourself is the day the people who depend on you stop respecting you too, because you've taught them the going rate. Wisdom, for me, came late. It came at 63 on a patio in King Street West in Toronto, with a streetcar bell ringing somewhere, and my stepdaughter telling me a truth I'd been refusing to hear for years. I'm grateful for it. I wish it had come at 40. It didn't. What I want for anyone listening is the courage I almost didn't find. The courage to close the checkbook. The courage to say no. The courage to let the people who claim to be your real family find out what real family actually costs when you're not quietly footing the bill. That's not bitterness. That's not revenge. That's the harder kind of love. The love that respects the other person enough to let them face the consequences of their own choices. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just clear. And clear, it turns out, is a better place to live than the one I had built for myself by always being available and always being silent. The mountains are out there in the dark, and the work in the shop is honest, and the men at the curling club know my name. That's enough. That was always enough. I just couldn't see it until I stopped paying for the noise.